Tonight, the spending review. The Chancellor says she rejects austerity and vows to renew Britain. Rachel Reeves sets out big spending increase for the NHS, housing and defence. The Tories warn of tax rises to come. There's millions more for policing the borders and a pledge to end spending on asylum hotels. But police chiefs warn that cuts to the overall Home Office budget will lead to Labour missing its manifesto commitments on cutting crime. And the Chancellor gives a shout-out to Nigel Farage, not once but twice in her statement. To laughter from Labour backbenchers, has her spending review seen off the threat to Labour from reform? Cutting through the spin to the bottom line, Nadeem Zahawi and John McDonnell, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Wednesday. I'm Ali Fortescue, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Yeah. We will come to the spending review very shortly, but first, some breaking news to bring you relating to verdicts in the cases against Harvey Weinstein. Let's speak straight away to our US correspondent, James Matthews. James Matthews, what's happened?
Hi, Ali. Yes, the jury has come back in a New York court with a verdict on Harvey Weinstein. You'll remember that he was convicted he was charged with 3 crimes, 2 of sexual assault, 1 of rape. Of those 3 charges, I can tell you there is no verdict on 1. The jury continue to deliberate on that. He's not guilty of 1 charge of sexual assault, but on charge 1, which is of sexual assault, he has been found guilty. So 3 charges that Harvey Weinstein faced in a New York court, 2 of sexual assault, 1 of rape. On 1 count of sexual assault, he's been found guilty. On another of sexual assault, not guilty. On 1 of rape, the jury haven't reached a verdict. They're being sent back in to deliberate. This story, of course, Ali, goes back to 2017, which is when allegations surfaced against Harvey Weinstein, film producer, movie mogul, the man behind famous films such as Pulp Fiction. There were a number of actresses, people involved in the movie business, people who had been in his orbit, who accused him of sexual crimes against them. It culminated in a conviction inside a New York court in 2020, and he was jailed for that. Subsequently, he was tried and convicted in a Los Angeles court in 2022 and was given a 16-year sentence then to run concurrently. So there were the 2 court appearances, the 2 sets of convictions. In the New York conviction, he appealed. Harvey Weinstein's lawyer said, look, he's been convicted, but there was much evidence that should not have been introduced throughout this trial. Appeal judges agreed and the conviction was quashed. That's what brought us to where we are today, a retrial, effectively, involving 3 alleged victims. And as I say, on 1 count, he has been found guilty. Separately, the Los Angeles conviction still stands. Weinstein is appealing against that, so that continues on, and he's a man who remains behind bars because of that Los Angeles conviction, no matter what has happened in New York. So that's where we are today, Ali. But of course, Harvey Weinstein at the centre of the Me Too movement, a movement which involved hundreds and more, or thousands of women who made claims of sexual assault, not just against Weinstein, but a number of cases came in the wake of the accusations against him and the trial of him. Very much a landmark case in terms of the Me Too movement. We are in a different time, of course, a different America politically. Many thought that Weinstein might have a chance of success in this retrial because of a different political and perhaps cultural context. But clearly, the jury has not seen it that way in the case of 1 set of charges of sexual assault. So the case is still live, Ali. The jury's gone back in to consider this rape charge, but that's the news today. Guilty on 1 count of sexual assault, not guilty on a second of sexual assault. The jury's still deliberating on the charge of rape.
OK, James Matthews, thank you so much for that update out of the US in that landmark case against Harvey Weinstein. Now, of course, in Westminster, we are talking today about the spending review. Now, don't let those two words put you off, because this really is a big moment, a moment when the Chancellor works out how she is going to spend £600 billion of our money. This is a moment that the Labour government really gets to set out what it is for. It is not a budget that happens every year. This was the last spending review.
Now, difficult decisions and all, we must deliver on the priorities of the British people.
A lot has changed since then, and the message has changed too. The message today: we're turning a corner. Rachel Reeves wants us to know that she is spending, and she is. She's spending billions on hospitals, schools, transport. There are losers too, places where spending is going to be squeezed, and we're going to come on to that on the show today. But for me, there are two big questions today. Firstly, the thing about capital spending, things like trains between Liverpool and Manchester, new nuclear energy, is that they take time to actually be felt by the public. People are going to need to be patient. And after years of this...
Our debts are too high and our deficit remains. Productivity is growing, but we still lag behind most of our competitors.
Yes, it will take time, and sometimes it will be difficult, but that was the change that people voted for.
It will be a hard road to walk. No doubt about it.
A decade of doom and gloom, really. People are being told to wait because things will get better. Well, there might not be that much patience about. The other big question is whether Rachel Reeves is really just crossing her fingers, rolling the dice even on an unpredictable economic backdrop, because someone who knows a thing or two about the economy is this man.
The Chancellor really is in the hands of the Office of Budget Responsibility. That's not their fault, that's her fault, as it were, because she set the fiscal rules and she's also meeting them by the most minuscule margin imaginable. What does that mean? That means if there's any negative news on the economic forecasts and the other forecasts, then she will have to raise taxes in order to meet those rules.
When Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, he said, "I'm an optimist, but an optimist who carries a raincoat." Has Rachel Reeves got a raincoat? Is she being totally straight today about some of the difficult choices that might be ahead? Just because you tell people the economy is improving doesn't mean it is. Just because you tell people that things are getting better doesn't mean that they can actually feel it right now. Well, first tonight, our political editor, Beth Rubby, has this report.
Pressure from every angle.
When will we feel better off, Chancellor?
Difficult questions from wherever she looks. But this a Chancellor determined not to be thrown off her stride.
What time you got, Rachel Reeves?
That's a question for the budget in the autumn. But this day matters too. This, the first spending review in 3 years, the moment when the Chancellor decides how to divvy up hundreds of billions to pay for our public services and set the roadmap for Britain and this government for years to come.
Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Rachel Reeves.
We are renewing Britain. But I know that too many people in too many parts of our country are yet to feel it. The purpose of this spending review is to change that.
Labour trying to turn the page on a difficult first year in power.
The priorities of this spending review are the priorities of working people. To invest in Britain's security, in Britain's health, and to grow Britain's economy so that working people are better off.
Defence, NHS, economic growth. These are 3 pillars of the Reeves plan. The Chancellor confirming that defence spending will rise to 2.6% of GDP by 2027, and the NHS the biggest winner.
This Labour government is making a record cash investment in our National Health Service, increasing real terms day-to-day spending by 3% per year for every single year of this spending review.
And as for the economy, Reeves allowing billions of borrowing to invest in Britain's infrastructure.
The rule has allowed me to increase public investment by over £100 billion in the autumn and a further £13 billion in the spring. Investment to rebuild our transport networks, to rebuild our defence capability, and to rebuild our energy security. In short, to grow our economy.
Capital to build new homes.
The biggest cash injection into social and affordable housing in 50 years. A new affordable homes programme in which I am investing £39 billion over the next decade.
And a pledge to end the use of hotels for asylum seekers by the end of this Parliament.
We will be ending the costly use of hotels to house asylum seekers in this Parliament, saving the taxpayer £1 billion a year.
But with public money tight, plenty of losers in this settlement too. The Home Office with a 1.7% cut in its day-to-day budget over the next 3 years, raising questions over whether the Home Secretary can deliver the 13,000 extra police promised in Labour's manifesto. Cuts too for the day-to-day budgets of the Foreign Office, Department for Culture and Local Government, while schools got squeezed. The opposition adamant Reeves won't stick to these plans.
This spending review is not worth the paper that it is written on. Because the Chancellor has completely lost control. This is the spend now, tax later review. Because the Right Honourable Lady knows she will need to come back here in the autumn with yet more taxes. And a cruel summer of speculation awaits.
And the unofficial opposition Reform UK looming large in the Chancellor's speech.
And his party have been in Parliament for less than a year, and yet they have already racked up £80 billion of unfunded commitments. They are simply not serious.
From the Commons to the hospital opposite Parliament to sell her big handout to the NHS. You have said that you would never make unfunded spending pledges, but you have this week because you've pledged £1.52 billion additional funding for the winter fuel allowance reversal. People are saying that there will be tax rises this autumn to fund increased spending. What do you say to them?
Well, we're sticking with the means test for the winter fuel allowance. I think that's an important principle. The wealthiest pensioners should not have their winter fuel bills subsidised, but we have increased the level of that means test. And before any money goes out the door, we will have a budget in the autumn, and we will show in the round, when the Office of Budget Responsibility update their forecast, how everything is consistent with the fiscal rules that I set out as Chancellor last autumn.
You didn't answer on tax.
Well, we'll set out our policies in the autumn, but we made the tax changes that were necessary last year to fund the spending that I've set out today.
A moment that's been months in the making. The Chancellor and Health Secretary clearly happy and relieved today. Laying foundations they hope will turn the government's fortunes around, but it may take years for voters to feel the same. Beth Rubby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, there are a lot of figures to get our head around today. What does it all mean? Our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, has been getting to grips with some of the government's numbers.
So what are the key things to take from this spending review? Well, there's an awful lot of numbers, but let's just dig through some of them. And first of all, we'll start with the big picture. What is this really all about? Well, look, this is showing you the state of the public finances, essentially. That is the tax money that comes in to the Exchequer, £1.2 trillion. That is spending, so £1.35 trillion. And you can tell this one is bigger than this one. Spending is bigger than receipts, which means the government needs to do borrowing. Now, normally when we're talking about these big set-piece events, a lot of it is about tax, a lot of it is about borrowing. But in this case, it's a spending review. So it's mostly about this, and actually not the entire bar here, because a large chunk of that is stuff that isn't covered in the spending review. It's called annually managed expenditure. That is things like benefits, debt interest, pensions, the lot of it. Actually, what we're talking about is this, departmental spending. This is what the spending review is really about. And actually, you can break down the amount of spending the government does into two quite important and distinct chunks. You've got current spending, so day-to-day spending on things like nurses' salaries, for instance. And then you've got investment, this smaller slice here. Now, that's spending on building things. It's spending on investing for the future. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that was the bit that the Chancellor wanted to talk about an awful lot in her speech, because that was where a lot of the extra money is going. And actually, if we kind of break that down, when it comes to that investment spending, there are some clear winners. So defence, a lot more money for defence, a lot more money for transport as well, and science innovation as well. So these are the areas where a lot of the extra money was spent, money that needs, it should be said, to be borrowed. But if we go back to the big picture again, as you can see, by far and away the biggest chunk of what the government spends its money on, or our money on, is current spending, day-to-day spending. And here, it's kind of interesting. OK, so what we got from the government, this is showing you day-to-day spending in the years that we're in at the moment and then future years. We knew how big the total was going to be in each of these years, off into the future. What we didn't have and what we just got is the breakdown. So we can actually break down these years. And this is the new information. This is basically what the spending review is about, showing you how much of this money goes to health, how much of it goes to defence, the Home Office, education, and so on. And there are some interesting takeaways here. If we look just at who are the biggest winners and the losers when it comes to this day-to-day spending, well, look, the biggest winner of the big departments, it should be said, health and social care. No surprises there, and actually that's kind of in tune with what we've had recently. Then justice, which has had a tough time in recent settlements, but now that does a little bit better this time around. But look at some of the losers. In particular, look at the Home Office. So some big question marks, given Home Office funding down by 1.7%, about whether you're going to have enough police officers in the coming years. But even within these supposed winners, there are some question marks, OK? So one of these 0.7%, that's education, OK? So it looks like it's positive, but now if you break it down year by year, so we'll break down those numbers year by year, and you can see that big picture disguises the fact that it's really punchy increases in spending in the first few years, and then real terms cuts towards the end of the forecast horizon. So a little bit of small print there. But the big picture, really, if we take that back there, remember that it's all about that, the stuff that we've learned about in the spending review. But the big picture for the government is not just about that, it's about the whole pie. And that is getting bigger and bigger. There's question marks over there whether there may well have to be tax rises in the future, and indeed whether there might have to be borrowing in the future. So we may be talking about taxes, not just spending, in the coming months.
We're going to hear from our panel. You can see them there very shortly. Former Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi and the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. But first, Ed, our economics editor, and Beth, our political editor, are both here. Beth, let's start with you. I mean, you both had a very busy day.
It's been a lot, hasn't it, Ed?
Yeah, I think this is your last of the day, so thanks.
It's not.
No, it's not.
No, I'm
okay.
still going after this.
Okay, good.
Ali.
Good.
That's fine. That's what I'm here for.
This is the most important one. Beth, I mean, you know, look, it felt like the story they were kind of trying to tell was this is a very good news story, billions being splashed around spending. Was Rachel Reeves being upfront about difficult choices ahead?
Look, I'd like to say a few things, but if I keep going on, just, you know, why don't we just start doing this off camera to me, Ed? Look, there's a few things, Stoner, and I think you actually touched on it there, where you broke down the education budget and said, actually, in the final 2 years of the spending review, look what's happening to it. There's loads of questions about how this unwinds in the next few days and where the pressure points are seen. And it was a slightly discombobulating statement, because there was a Chancellor just seeming to be throwing out endless amounts of investment in this golden era where there was endless pot of money for all of these investments. And a lot of it was, of course, capital investment, which is a different budget, as Ed's been talking about, to the day-to-day spending. And I think the things I would say in that is there are questions within the day-to-day spending about pressure points. The first is on the Home Office. I asked the Chancellor when I saw her today, do you still stand by manifesto commitments in the Home Office, and that is police numbers to 13,000, halving violence against women and girls, and halving serious violence, that they are manifesto pledges. She insisted that they are pledges that still stand, but when you actually look at the Home Office budget, and I've got this here, there is a real terms cut of 1.7% over the period, and the Chancellor spent a lot of time saying no, because the police will get some of the money from local council budgets. But there are questions about the deliverability of manifesto pledges. The second thing I'd say on that is there are questions about where tax rises might come. So I asked her about council tax bills, and she was insisting around the police precept, that's the bit of your council tax that's allocated to spending on police services in your area, the envelope is set. But when you actually look at local government here, and I've got this here, local government, you can see that overall, it's going down 1.4% in day-to-day spending, but the spending power is going up. The spending power, does that mean that we are going to see rises in our council tax bills? And I think that is a question, like, how does this actually play out? And at the moment, it is unclear, but I think there are questions that will come in the coming days. And those questions about council tax feed into bigger questions about tax rises, because all of the economists that we talk, you spoke to Paul Johnson, or Paul Johnson was on actually earlier today, and he's talking about other funding commitments, the welfare reversal on winter fuel allowance, 1.25 billion. You've got questions about lifting the two-child benefit cap, that could cost up to 3 billion. You've got questions about changing welfare cuts, that could cost, I don't know, up to a couple more billion. And then you've got into a question about, in the contours of a really, really tight financial situation where the Chancellor's headroom, so the money she's got to play with to fulfil her rule of tax receipts being used to fund public spending and not debt, is she going to have to raise taxes in the autumn? So there are loads of questions that have come out of this. I think in the big picture, there is a story there about laying the foundations for growth for Britain, and genuinely, in some of the announcements around social housing, nuclear power investment, rail and transport, of course they're going to be welcomed across the country, but they could take a decade plus to kick in. And in the meantime, what will people see at the end of the Parliament? And I guess the risk for the government is in the next 18 months to 2 years, what people are going to feel is a squeeze still, and that's going to leave them dissatisfied.
Really interesting. OK, Ed, I mean, this spending review hasn't had the OBR forecast in a normal way, so it's probably been a bit more difficult to decipher. You were talking about some surprise when it comes to education.
No one needs to cry for us, moaning about how hard it's been, but it has been hard. I think the consequence of that. OK, so today, rather than getting a document from the government and then the OBR and they kind of mark their homework, this time we just got the document from the government, and we, for instance, that revelation about education and how actually it looks like it's rising. And the Chancellor said it's rising. And obviously it is rising, if you take an average over the period. But the fact that it's falling in the final 2 years, which will be a big deal when it comes to it, that's something we had to kind of go through all of the numbers line by line. And I suspect that is going to happen for a lot of this stuff. There are going to be quite a few bombs that are buried here that we're going to find about, in the next few days as a result of that. And that's, that may or may not be a problem for the government. The big picture, though, as Beth says, there is a big picture here, which is that this is a government which is spending more money. It's not spending dramatically more. It's not completely changing the nature of the state, which is, to some extent, what Gordon Brown was doing in his early spending reviews in kind of 2000, 2002. That really moved the needle in terms of what kind of a role the state played. This doesn't do that, but it does gradually increase spending a little bit more on day-to-day stuff. It means you've got maybe better public services, gradually, a little bit in certain places. Will people notice that? I don't really know. I think the thing that, whether they notice it or not, is definitely big is there is a lot more money going into investments, so more into transport, more into defence. Again, whether that kind of trickles through and means that you get that kind of feel-good factor or not, I think we'll have to wait and see. But the final kind of thing and the final sting of the tail is you've now set out, so the government's now set out what it's going to spend its money on for the next 3-4 years, OK? It doesn't have a lever to pull if things go wrong on spending, which means that if, God forbid, there's a recession or something looks bad in the future or the numbers don't come in as well as you expected, what's your lever that's left? It's taxes. So legitimately, we will be asking the government about whether they're going to be raising taxes a lot in the coming months. For that reason, they've left themselves, kind of open to that question now.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to think quickly, though. I do think what is interesting about the gamble, if you like, she's taken is the health budget. So on the proof points for the public, the government have clearly decided that cutting NHS waiting lists is going to be the thing that they can go into the next election and say, stick with us, we've
showing that we can renew Britain over this decade. And I think the challenge for the government is what they're trying to do here really is create enough momentum in enough areas that when you get to another election in 3 to 4 years' time, there is enough proof points for people in their daily lives that they will roll the dice again on Labour. That's the calculation, that's the hope of the government. Whether it comes good is a whole different question, but I think that's where they're going in the choices they made.
Thank you so much, Beth Rubby, our political editor, and Ed Conway, our economics editor. Well, I've been putting just that to a Treasury Minister, actually. We've been talking to Emma Reynolds, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and here is what she had to say. Thanks so much for talking to us. Big day for you, busy day for you. Can I just confirm, are you ruling out taxes going up in the autumn?
Well, what we've set out today is spending plans which are a consequence of the tough decisions we made on tax last autumn, in the autumn budget in 2024. And the reason that we had to take those tough decisions to raise taxes on businesses and others was because of the inheritance from the previous Tory government, a big, as you know, fiscal black hole, 22 billion, and also... yes, indeed, I know that, but that's... we very much, when we discovered the books, we were shocked about what was in there, and a stagnating economy and public services on their knees. So the spending review is in line with the allocation of the envelope, if you see what I mean, of the budget and also the spring statement. And what we're doing today is we are setting out what the government's priorities are, which are very much in line with the manifesto we put to the British people in July, investing record amounts in the NHS, investing in our schools, investing in infrastructure, investing in defence, keeping our country safe. So that's what we're doing today. We've got the fastest growing economy in the G7 in the first quarter of this year, but we're not making tax announcements today.
Well, that's because countries like Japan and the US are going backwards. But the question was, are we going to see tax rights? Because, we've had the good news, well, the attempt at a good news story by the Chancellor today. The question that a lot of people are asking is, are you going to have to come back with tax rises?
Well, we're not going to write this autumn's budget
Are you ruling
now.
it out, though?
Well, as I say, we are not going to write this autumn's budget now, but we have £9 billion
so you're not ruling it out.
of fiscal... Well, I'm not ruling it in, I'm not ruling it out. We have got £9 billion of fiscal headroom, which is significantly more than the Tories had when they were in power at the end of their time in power. We've got a growing economy, and we, as the Chancellor did say in the Chamber, the budget in the autumn last year was a once-in-a-generation budget where we had to do some very tough things, and we're not going to have another budget like that in the future.
The reason I ask is because Paul Judson, who does know a lot about the economy of the IFS, has said that she is meeting her fiscal rules by the most minuscule of margins, and that any negative news on economic forecasts, and we've all seen how unpredictable the global economy can be, will mean that she will have to find more money, probably through tax rises.
Well,
is he wrong?
Well, the OBR said when we did our spring statement that we were going to meet both fiscal rules early in the period. So, look, things change, the world changes, we have to react to that.
But, growth forecasts have got worse. Well, it has gone up.
Some of them have and some of them haven't. So the IMF has revised
you're crossing your figures and hoping for the best here.
Well, look, we can't control global markets, and I'm in charge of financial services policy. We can't control everything that happens in the world. No government can. And, of course, we have to react to events when events do happen. But we've got strong economic fundamentals, real-term wages. Wages have been rising faster in the first 10 months of our government than the first 10 years of the last Conservative government. We've had 4 interest rate cuts. We've got the strongest growth in the G7 in the first quarter of this year. So
Paul Johnson says the fiscal situation is less good now than it was last summer. Is he wrong?
Well, we, as a government, went to the British people and promised them change. And, of course, that requires investment and reform of our public services. So we, as set out today, are going to be spending 2.3% more in governmental spending. And we have, as you know, from what the Chancellor has said, carved out room in the fiscal rules to ensure that we can invest to grow the economy. It's only and that is in the long-term interests of the country, which will mean that the economy will grow more quickly and will get more money into people's pockets. And part of our plan for change is raising living standard. That's what growth is all about. It's not about lines on a chart, which don't mean much to people.
I guess, you know, what I'm asking is, you're banking on growth, and Harold Wilson once said, I'm an optimist, but an optimist that's got a raincoat. You know, does Rachel Reeves, do you have a raincoat?
Well, we're banking on growth because all the policies that we're putting in place, including the huge planning reforms that were scored by the ABR, the biggest non-fiscal lever for growth that the ABR has scored. We've already set those planning reforms out in December. Those were the ones that aren't in the bill that we're taking through. So there are other ways to create growth in the economy, create the right conditions for growth, other than tax and spend. And the planning reforms that we're putting through are one of those, and also making sure that our regulators, which I'm doing as in charge of financial services, are really doubling down on growth and ensuring that we kickstart the economy and get businesses investing.
So as a result of all this, can you make some guarantees? You talk about houses. You're guaranteeing those 1.5 million houses.
We have promised 1.5 million. The announcement today of 39 billion in affordable homes over a period of 10 years is a huge commitment from the government in affordable homes. But we're also putting through those planning reforms through Parliament to ensure that house builders are not land banking, that they are building the homes that we need. And I'm also working with the Financial Conduct Authority to ensure that the rules around mortgage lending are proportionate and fair, so that we have more first-time buyers in the market.
Who are the losers today?
In every spending review, there are some departments who receive better increases than others, let's put it like that. Some of the lines on the graph, there's a story behind them. So, for example, let's take transport. One of the reasons that the transport budget doesn't look quite so good is that actually the rail subsidy that we need at the moment isn't as high as it was during COVID times, because there are more people travelling in on the trains. There's a story behind all of this. The FCDO...
What about the Home Office? Real terms cut of 1.4% a year.
The Home Office, yeah, but the policing was separated out, if you look at the graph. So there's a 2.3% real terms increase in the policing budget. The rest of the budget that you're talking about is because we have set out today that we are going to stop using hotels, which are extremely expensive for asylum seekers. We're going to bear down on the cost of that. We're going to accelerate the asylum seeking process. So we've announced £200 million as part of a transformation fund to get through that backlog and to speed that process up, so that people who don't have the right to be here are deported more quickly, and that those who do have the right to be here stay and start to contribute.
One of your big pledges was around violence against women and girls, and the CEO of Refuge today has said that a critical opportunity has missed. There's a £307 million shortfall in spending on violence against women and girls.
Well, the Home Secretary will set out in more detail how they're going to spend the settlement that we've announced today. But the government, from the Home Secretary to Jess Phillips to myself to the Prime Minister, really, really passionate about the pledge that we made in the manifesto to halve the levels of violence against women.
And that's still the pledge?
That is still the pledge, indeed.
And so what do you make of her words?
Well, you'll forgive me, but there are so many different layers to this. And as I've said, the Home Secretary will set out in more detail the different elements of her settlement in the weeks to come.
One of the big winners is health. You know, can you guarantee that when you get the reform plans that we're expecting soon, West Streeting is not going to come back asking for more money?
Well, this is a record level of investment in the health service. We prioritise this at the election. This is not something that should be a surprise to anyone.
Is this it, this 30 billion odd?
Well, it's it for the spending review period, and we are intent on continuing to bring down waiting lists. That's a specific promise we made to the British people. We know that people were waiting too long, far too long for operations, which is bad for them. It's also bad for productivity. It's bad for our economy.
So with this money, that is still very much the commitment, cut waiting lists by 18 weeks by the end of Parliament?
Yeah,
okay.
2 18 weeks, yeah.
And last question, Mel Stride has said, when the going gets tough, the Chancellor blinks. Is that right? You know, when it comes to the winter fuel U-turn, and we're expecting watering down on welfare reform, on the two-child benefit cap. Is that right?
I found his whole approach just not very believable. It didn't ring true to me. The Chancellor has had to take some really, really tough decisions because of the inheritance from his from the previous government that he was a full member of and was in charge of working pensions for quite some time, and I used to be in that department. It's right that now that the economy is growing more rapidly, that we look again at winter fuel payment. We're still means testing it because the wealthiest people in this country don't need £200 or £300 a year, depending on their age, to help pay their fuel bills. We've set the threshold now obviously much higher because we listened to the feedback. We knew that there were big concerns. But one of the things that Mel Stride isn't serious about is the triple lock, which is worth a lot more year on year than the winter fuel payment. So it's right that we have rebalanced our approach there. But I wouldn't have said that anyone thinks that Rachel Reeves isn't tough.
OK, Emma Reynolds, you've had a really busy week. I think this is your last interview of the day, is that right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Well, coverage of the spending review is sure to feature heavily in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the political commentator, Adam Bolton. Well, as you can see, I'm surrounded by former chancellors and shadow chancellors. Our panel, Nadeem Zahawi, briefly chancellor, John McDonnell, of course, former shadow chancellor. But first, let's talk to the current shadow chancellor, Mel Stride. Thank you so much for coming in, Mel. This has been pitched as a good news day. You know, billions of pounds for trains, for doctors. Is it a good thing?
Well, you've got to ask where's the money coming from and can we afford it? So where the money's coming from is taxing businesses, which is killing growth, and a lot of borrowing. And can we afford it? No, not the way that this government has run our economy. So they came into office, loaded up taxes on businesses, which slowed down growth. It also drove up prices, actually, because a lot of that tax was passed on by way of higher prices, borrowed a lot of money, spent a lot of money, created inflationary pressures, means that interest rates have been higher for longer, and they've added to this mountain of debt on which we are now paying £100 billion per year, which is twice what we spend on defence. And then if you look at the resilience that the Chancellor built in, i.e. the headroom against her fiscal targets, it was wafer thin. She blew the whole lot from the budget last autumn. She repaired it in the spring. It seems fairly clear to me that that will be blown come the autumn, and we'll be facing more tax cuts, more tax increases, and more difficult decisions in the future. And I think the economy is now actually in a very precarious position. And we need to look at those bond markets and what they think about lending money to our country at the moment.
And we'll come on to the precarious position that you left the economy in shortly, but...
Well, I don't think that's quite how I phrased it.
Well, OK, let's do it now then.
Fair.
I mean, you know, Liz...
No. Well, no, OK, well, let's deal with that. On the day of the general election...
was brought up a lot, you know, are you guys ever going to get over that?
Well, no, I've said what I've said on the mini-budget.
You didn't
which was
apologise,
that mistakes were made. I was very clear about that, and I have said...
Why won't you apologise?
I have said that will never, ever happen again. We have fiscal responsibility in the DNA of my party, and that is the basis on which we will proceed and take decisions into the future. And it's important, more important now than ever before, because we've got a Labour Party that's messing up the economy in the way I've described, and you've got a Reform Party which is prepared to promise everybody anything they want, including massive tax cuts, with no idea
It's
as to how
interesting
they're
that the Chancellor brought up reform a couple of times, more than she brought up you guys. I mean, you know, is reform now the official opposition?
Well, no, we are the official opposition. That's why I was at the dispatch box. Yeah. No, and when it comes to things like the backtracking and U-turn on the winter fuel payment, we are the party that has been in there holding this government to account, and we are the opposition. That's why I was responding today to Rachel Reeves.
Does it frustrate you, the amount that Liz Truss comes up? You know, does it annoy you that you don't seem to be able to move on from this despite speeches like the one you made?
What matters going forward is that people are very confident that whilst we have a Labour Party that is mismanaging the economy, whilst we have a Reform Party that doesn't seem to be at all bothered about how it funds the extravagant promises that it makes, that they have in the Conservative Party a party that understands that fiscal responsibility, making sure the numbers add up, is absolutely a prerequisite for a healthy economy. And if you get it wrong, everybody pays the price.
How would you make sure the numbers add up then?
Well, by doing the deep thinking over the next months and years in the lead up to our manifesto, and making sure that we have a programme for renewing and radically rewiring our economy in which the numbers add up. In other words, not making unfunded spending commitments or tax cuts, making sure we come forward with proposals that add up in that way, and that's exactly what we do.
I mean, there's been a lot of deep thinking. I think people actually want to know what you do.
Well, we have time between now and the next general election.
But controversially, where would you make some
Well, Ali, we have said things. For example, we have said that we will reverse the agricultural property relief changes, which is going to destroy family farms. We've said we'll do the same for business property relief, which is going to destroy family businesses. We've said we've unwind the VAT on schools. We've said that we will step back from the 2050 net zero target because it's unattainable, and we need to get the balance right between people that are struggling to pay their bills and commitments towards the environment. We've said a lot of things about net migration and illegal migration and disapplying the Human Rights Act when it comes to deporting people from our shores. So we've said an awful lot. But my point is that if we are to create a better economy for the future, there are no simple, quick fixes. We have to do the deep thinking around taxation, the size of the state, skills, welfare reform, supply side reform as well on building roads and all the rest of it, and also energy costs. You know, how do we get our energy costs down such that we're not paying 4 times what they do in America and Canada, or 7 times what they do in China? Now, to address those things is not a 5-minute quick fix, and that's why it's quite right, and Kemi is quite right on this, we should take our time to get it right.
OK, Mel Stride, we will come back to you, but I do just want to bring in our panel. John, what do you make of what Mel Stride said and everything you've heard today?
I'm a political artisan. I think we all are. So Mel had a choice today. When you had a chance, you can either do a clinical analysis of what the government's doing and provide an alternative. You clearly couldn't do that, so they're going to be deep thinking for another 3 or 4 years. Or you shout. So Mel chose the approach of shouting, basically, because he's on a difficult wicket. The reality is that we've had 14 years of a Conservative government that has implemented austerity, and one element of austerity I thought was a real mistake is when they actually cut investment in infrastructure overall. So what Rachel Reeves was doing today is this is make or break with our economy. We've got to invest large amounts of money in our infrastructure. I would have gone further, but she changed her fiscal rules to something close to what I was advocating. She did a review of the Green Book, so therefore the investment was spread around the country. So I welcomed that. And that's what she had to do. Otherwise, we'll never get growth into the economy. 14 years of underinvestment has really hit us hard. So I think she's done the right thing on that. The problem I've got with it is that there's no political strategy attached to it, because investment like that is the point that you and Beth Rubby are making. It takes a while for people to really gain the benefit of it. And in the meantime, we've still got, there might not be mathematical austerity because some department growth is there, but actually austerity will be felt, particularly if the cuts in the welfare benefits go through. And austerity will be felt in some of those departments like education, which aren't getting enough to meet the growing demand that we've got. So that's my criticism.
So you calling it austerity?
Well, I think it is. If you can't not call it austerity when you're cutting nearly $7 billion out of welfare benefits and you're hitting some of the hardest in terms of, well, the disability benefits. So that was my argument today, is well done in terms of Rachel Reeves and the capital investment, but actually the political strategy won't work whilst you're implementing austerity measures like that. And I think what will happen in the coming weeks, up until the budget, I think we'll be forcing a rethink on issues like that. And then we'll come to the discussion, which Mel did rightfully raise, what do we do about redistribution of wealth and taxation? And my view is we're going to have to come to an element of redistribution, which means corporations pay more, but also means a wealth tax.
Do you agree with that, Nadeem?
Of course not.
So I think the problem for Rachel is that she's learning a painful lesson of the unintended consequences of what she did in the budget. Yeah, Mel is right. When you load up businesses with £25 billion of taxes, what do you think is going to happen? Growth becomes anemic. When you reverse the deterrent of the Rwanda processing offshore, what do you think happens? You get more illegal migration. You get much bigger bill for hotels. When you have a bill going through Parliament, which will be an employment reduction bill, right? We're still, by the way, living off the Thatcher reforms of a flexible labour market to create the sort of growth in this economy, which this government will again pay the price for. So your chart that you showed on education, for me, that is the most telling thing. And what you're probably going to see over the next week is more, it's a cynical dead cat bounce, right? She's thinking about next year's local elections. They don't want to get hammered in the way they've just got hammered, right? And education gets a bit more next year after, then it drops and it gets a cut, right? That is a real problem for this government. And I congratulate you because you managed to get the Treasury Minister, which will probably make a headline if someone is watching carefully in the newsrooms tonight, to admit that she can't rule out tax rises, right? Which is what Mel has been saying, what Kemi's been saying all along. It is the Chancellor that is spending today but is going to tax you tomorrow. That is the problem she's got. It's disjointed. There's no real strategy here. Where is the growth going to come from when we lost 11,000 wealth creators to this country? Losing them to where? Italy. Maloney, right, has managed to persuade some of the best entrepreneurs to move. Why? Because he's got a flat tax of £200,000 a year, 200,000 euros. I'm advocating that the Chancellor should eat humble pie and say, I've made a mistake on the non-dom stuff. It's far too harsh a regime. Let's get the wealth creators back, charge £400,000 flat tax. Practical measures to get the economy growing. He hates it. He hates it because he is dogmatic about hurting the wealth creators of this country. That's his problem.
Go on, John.
I can't
He
with a
hates
straight
it.
face when there's someone sitting here was associated with the trust budget. You're suffering from that as well, Mel. You admit that. I know you don't want to apologise, but
John,
look, this is the stuff that almost brought our country to its knees.
But where the Dean is right is when you talk about taxing the wealthy, OK, and wealth taxes and all the rest of it. The Dean is right. I think we've lost 15,000 very wealthy people from our country.
Interesting.
If you look, but hold on, if you look at the, if you look at the tax that 15,000 were paying, it would take a third of a million people on average earnings to cover that tax loss. So who's it hurting? It's hurting ordinary working people who will have to shoulder more of a burden. That's the point.
Recent research has demonstrated that sort of tax flight of the rich is not true. It's inaccurate.
It's happening. They're leaving.
The research was published last week.
Second only to your favourite country, China,
No, I'm sorry.
in losing wealth creators.
I'm sorry.
China is the only country.
My favourite country. It was George Osborne.
You had the Red Book.
I threw it at him. I threw it at him.
You forgot that.
I threw it at him because he was so often in Peking. I thought you might find it useful. But the research last week demonstrated that's a myth. That figure is a myth. And what we have now is the most grotesque levels of inequality. And it isn't just holding our economy back, it's causing social division. In the 1990s, we had 15 billionaires in this country. We've now got 165 billion. They own, in terms of the wealth of this country, the top 20% have nearly 63% of the wealth. All we're asking for is a fair taxation system that we can invest in our public services. It's not a lot to ask for.
But there's no point in driving the wealth creators away from our shores. I mean, that is a terribly self-inflicted wound.
The research demonstrates it's not true.
Dubai. They go to all these different
Look at the objective research. You've got it wrong.
Right. This has been very enlightening. And actually, I'm sorry, John, because it is two former Tories on one
I can take two of the right ones, don't worry.
OK, thank you all.
Fighting the Second World War.
And thank you very much, Mel Stride, for coming in after a very busy day in the Chamber. Now, the Chancellor acknowledged today that almost a year on from Labour's landslide election victory, too many people are yet to feel the promise of national renewal. So how has today's spending review gone down with the public? Well, our social affairs correspondent Becky Johnson has been finding out.
Closed to the public, now home to dozens of male asylum seekers. This hotel in Peterborough, like more than 200 others around the country, a symbol of a migration crisis that's costing taxpayers billions and shifting UK politics to the right. Bakor from Turkey arrived by small boat 6 months ago using a translation app. He told me he'd rather live in a house than the hotel, explaining that he doesn't like having to share a room.
If they stop giving people hotel rooms, will as many people come to the UK, do you think?
No.
No?
No.
Why?
When there's no place to stay, people don't want to come, is his answer. In the nearby city centre, the Chancellor's pledge to end hotel use for migrants prompted mixed reaction.
I'm sure that'll please lots of people.
Is it an issue locally for people?
I guess it is. Everybody's got an opinion on it. We're all human beings. We're all entitled to something. But no, I think it's the right decision.
You'd want to make sure that there was a viable alternative before you did it. But if she can manage that in the right kind of way, that's good. Good for the asylum seekers, good for the local communities.
They've got to put them somewhere, or else they're homeless and then they create more problems. I think they need to have a designated place and a secure place.
Is it the right decision for the government to stop using hotels to house asylum seekers? What do you make of that?
I agree with that.
Why?
Well, I don't think they should. People like that shouldn't have them for the immigrants.
There are more than 30,000 asylum seekers currently in hotels, and they keep coming. Even as the Chancellor prepared to deliver her speech, more boats were arriving in Dover.
Funding to cut the asylum backlog will be increased, but that just means more claims will be processed, and around half of people are usually successful, more when you count those allowed to stay following an appeal. That's thousands more people who'll need somewhere to live.
Serco, that has a government contract for housing asylum seekers, is now looking for private rentals. Potentially competing with locals, it could push prices up, fueling the housing crisis and cancelling some of the benefits from billions being invested building affordable homes. Closing the hotels will likely prove popular at the polls, but it won't solve the problems created by tens of thousands of new arrivals each year. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Peterborough.
Oh, well, that was a view from the public. But what about MPs? I went to take the temperature in Central Lobby right after the Chancellor's statement today, and here's what they had to say. In a word, the spending review for you.
Meh. Fantastic. Fairly predictable. I guess if you're a family looking at this today, you'll be in a position where if you're suffering from the cost of living crisis, you're saying, what changes this?
I mean, I've got to say, there's one or two things you welcome, which is more spending on affordable housing. We need to do that.
Tax, I think, is the word that is clearly coming from this. I think it's in the back of everybody's mind.
Are you going to have to come back for tax rises?
Look, it remains to be seen what comes in the future, but we've resisted that so far.
That doesn't sound like a no.
We've built that, I'm not the Chancellor, we've built that headroom to be able to invest heavily in the things that matter to our communities.
Harold Wilson once said, I'm an optimist, but an optimist that carries a raincoat. Do you think Rachel Reeves has got a raincoat?
You've always got to carry a raincoat in this job, but you've always got to be optimistic as well.
Now, these announcements are also never without a few jokes here and there, and there was one MP the Chancellor had in her sights today.
We must have a strong NHS. Not as the Reform Party have called for, an insurance-based system. We believe in a publicly funded National Health Service free at the point of use. Now, perhaps the member for Clacton should spend some more time focusing on the priorities of the British people and less time in the Westminster Arms. Although, Mr. Speaker, after this week, perhaps the Two Chairman pub might be a better fit.
Right, let's bring Nadeem and John back in. Just to explain that joke, the Two Chairman pub,
this pub round the corner.
Exactly where the Chancellor goes after these sorts of statements.
It's sort of obviously because Zia decided to resign and then come back 48 hours later.
They've had a couple of chairmen.
Sort of Elon Musk-ish. But look, I think actually in many ways, and I think we agree on this, you know, I grew up in a world where you don't name your opponent, right, on your leaflets. You don't give them any oxygen. And you just focus on your own message.
I think campaigning.
It's the 101 campaigning. I think what that says, Nigel will be very happy tonight because he's been named, right? It's played on your programmes, played everywhere else. He'll be lionised by his team, by his followers. So I think it's an error of judgment.
No, but there's difference. I'm old enough to remember Dennis Healey. And when he did that thing about savage by a dead sheep, you can destroy a politician with humour.
True.
But that wasn't that sort of joke. And he lapped it up, Farage. And you just don't give him those platforms. And again, that's just political technique. I think that was a mistake.
Let's just end with some final thoughts on the spring. Not the spring statement, the spending review. There have been a few of these, haven't there?
Yes.
But this is actually very significant because it doesn't happen very often. It's obviously huge amounts of money. Nadeem, what are your kind of key takeaways? Because we know that there are going to be squeezes as well as a good news.
Yeah, I mean, my real worry, and obviously I'm passionate about education, it's the department I know best and I love the most. I think the cuts that will come in year 3 and 4 is going to be problematic. I think the cuts to the Home Office are going to be problematic. Why? Because, yeah, you're increasing some spending on borders, but you've got no deterrent. So you're going to see numbers continue to rise of illegals coming across, right? The whole hotel thing will be seen to be a smoke and mirrors thing, because they'll take them out of hotels and put them in private rented accommodation. It will drive, I think, the same perception that this government cares more about illegal migration in terms of not really dealing with them properly than it does about people in John's constituency and elsewhere. And I think that'll be problematic for her, because growth will remain anemic as long as there are policies that don't allow businesses to invest. You've got an employment, in my view, reduction act coming through Parliament, bill coming through Parliament, because it will make it harder for businesses to take people on, makes the labour market much less flexible. All these things are going to compound the same errors of the first year, and it'll get worse for Rachel and for
This is more of what we saw through 14 years of austerity under Conservative government. So I dismiss that completely. It's almost like stepping back in time. The issue for me now is, of course, we need the capital spend. We need more capital spend, if anything, on a planned basis in the longer term as well. But the reality is what is happening in people's day-to-day lives this week, next week, and all the rest. And we cannot be seen as an austerity party by implementing cuts to the poorest in our society. So I was worried we haven't learnt the mistakes of the winter fuel allowance mistake. And we haven't learned it either over the two-child benefit cap, where we're leaving children in dire poverty. There are 1 million children out there who are classified as in dire poverty, near destitution. And there is now the threat to put what the government says 250,000 additional people in poverty as a result of the cuts to the disability benefits. We've got to learn the lessons of the mistakes that were made.
Do you think there will be tax rises?
There'll have to be tax rises.
There
has to be redistribution.
When she misses her rule, because it's such wafer-thin headroom.
Let's be real.
If you miss... Just hear me out for a second. If you miss your own rules, right, and you have anemic growth, the only thing you do is tax more. It's a death spiral.
Not at all.
It is a death spiral.
You ensure you have a fair taxation system and you tackle the grotesque inequalities that we have in our society. Otherwise, our society will be divided for the next generation. And it is about those children out there. There are 4.3 million children in poverty at the moment. We all have got to agree we've got to do something about that.
Yeah, it's growth. Okay. You need growth.
I'm afraid
growth takes
that is
time.
all we have got time for. Thank you both, John McDonnell and Nazim Zahawi. Well, that's it. What a big day it has been here in Westminster. I will see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee.